I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, California, and I specialize in working with trauma and trauma related disorders and anxiety disorders. So for me, it was a combination of things that I had been trained in, like mindfulness, mindfulness based stress reduction, self compassion, all these kinds of mind body therapies as well as my own healing work and what was introduced to me in my own healing work, which was a lot more somatic and sensory motor work and inner child work. It's so important for me to let people know that I'm not sharing these things just coming from this place of expertise and training, but really lived experience. And for me, it wasn't until much later in life, actually, that I started identifying many things that I had experienced as traumas. But I think there was always this part of me kind of pulling to discover those things.
It's always so different when you're working with someone who has been through what you yourself are going into, especially when you're talking about the deeper inner work that you're doing and how triggering it can be as well. But what are some of the sources of trauma that we often don't notice or have language for that pop up later?
What I see more overlooked, but oftentimes even more impactful, are traumas that have to do with our early relationships. It's where we learn about relationships and safety and care and love and trust. And this is where we get our first sense of ourselves. So, those relationships, things that happen early in those relationships, whether it's bad things happening in those relationships or the absence of good things, the absence of the things that help us feel kind of securely attached and regulated as we're kids and move into adulthood. Think of it as like they have these arms that go out into all these different places in our lives, our relationships, our sense of self, what we pursue in our careers, our emotion regulation, our mood, our coping, like all of that gets very solidified early on in those attachment relationships. I think if you add another layer onto that, when a trauma happens in the context of an attachment relationship that isn't safe like that, you're alone in your pain, you're alone in your suffering without a safe adult, whether that's because they're the source of that trauma, they're in denial of that trauma, they're neglectful, whatever the case might be. I think that always takes that pain to a much more intense and much more impactful level for most of us.
It's almost like being wounded twice because you have the trauma and then you have it's not being validated, seen, acknowledged, or even it's being some people, are completely led to believe it didn't happen a lot of times. And I think that those are the hardest ones, as you said, where they just stick with you. What are the ways that they sort of influence us later on? You mentioned that, of course, later with your relationships, it will be there, but maybe subtle ways that we don't recognize.
If we're going to take this example where somebody had a trauma in the context of an unsafe or unsupportive attachment relationship early on, lots of things happen, but two big things happen. One is disconnection from yourself. Because if your experience, if there's no place for your experience, no one to recognize your reality, and you're a kid, right? You don't have resources and skills built up yet. Like even your nervous system's still developing. So oftentimes our only choice is to disconnect from ourselves. That falls into two categories. Physically disconnecting from your body. We might live a lot in our heads. Doesn't mean that you're dissociating, but we might just be thinkers and intellectualizers. We might be very cut off kind of from the neck down. And some of us even struggle to like meet our basic needs where I've been sitting for 3 hours. I haven't had water. Tiny things that, just come as a result of being disconnected from the body. We don't recognize signs of stress. We don't recognize when we need a break. We're really good at pushing through and tolerating a lot of pain. All these little things that like we talk about now is burnout and so on and so forth. The other part of that is disconnection from your authenticity. Knowing yourself is about knowing your inner experience, that kind of self knowledge. Huge part of that is our body. Most of us are so in our heads. We think that if I can understand myself here, it sort of fixes everything. Self knowledge starts with being aware of your body sensations, and your emotions live in your body too. So when we've disconnected from our body over here, we actually start to lose touch with our authenticity, who we are, what we like, what we don't like, where we need a boundary, what excites us, what gives us a sense of curiosity. And that also has this ripple effect into how we show up in relationships, like how many of us sort of chameleon way our way through a lot of relationships and situations. Of course, we all do that to some extent, and that's like healthy social adaptation, but really putting on a version of ourselves that we think is more acceptable, more likable, more palatable. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that's all around safety, to be disconnected from the pain in my body, the emotional pain, the memories, to be disconnected from my authentic self, my emotions, and who I really am, all comes down to safety. So when it is not safe to be who you are, whether that's just a kid who has a different temperament or way of being in the world than their family, all the way to a trauma that is denied or invalidated or minimized, when it's not safe to be who we are, we get really skilled at presenting a different version of ourselves, all the while holding all of this inside.
This is always fascinates me because I know that you also work from you're looking at the somatic side too and how you keep all of that trauma, the emotions in because it stays, right? It's there even if you don't acknowledge it. It's there. And the sense of safety that you don't have, so you disconnect, I relate to a lot. I was thinking too when you were saying this about how the authenticity piece, because I've never thought of it that way. I know some people, for example, that are so charismatic and they're so socially acceptable, people love them, that have some of the deepest traumas I have ever seen when you have deeper conversations with them. And it almost feels like they're putting on this persona to break away or shield all of the pain that's underneath. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it feels that way.
I so appreciate you saying that because I don't want anyone who resonates with this to listen and think that that's a judgment or something negative, because it's actually something I really think about these as like brilliant ways that somebody survived, right? For a kid without support, a kid who's in pain, going through emotional pain, trauma, to have figured out that there's a version of myself that will keep me safe is so incredibly skillful. And sometimes it can serve us really well in a lot of ways, right? Where most of us get stuck is that we end up holding on to that long after the trauma has passed, or once we're in a safe relationship or safe environment, but we're still showing up as that safe, filtered version of who we are. And I think this is where we get into the relational impact. I mean, one tiny part of the relational impact here is if we're constantly presenting this version of ourselves that's not authentic. People who do that are often very skilled at also meeting other people's needs and caretaking, knowing how to show up for them. But we often then don't show up for ourselves. We don't show up as who we are. And then when we're not showing up as who we are, it's not only that we can't get our needs met, but we don't feel seen. And being seen is so incredibly important. It, in my opinion, it is one of the closest things to feeling loved, if not the same. So if all this trauma and the way that we survived has developed in a way where we're shielding younger parts of ourselves that experience that pain, that's great for when it is unsafe. But when there's opportunity for us to connect, it makes it incredibly difficult and can actually leave us in a cycle where we, like, some of those trauma related feelings or beliefs almost feel reinforced, where it's like, I'm unseen, I'm unheard.
It's almost like this resentment is created. I've felt this to a small degree before where you don't feel like you're being seen because you're hiding, and then you feel resentful because your needs and what you want is not acknowledged. You feel like it's so obvious, right? Or people should know, they should ask, and they don't. And then it creates this feeling of, well, I don't want to be with this person or these people because they don't see me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is so important that we recognize, the role of the other person, and are they a person who sort of benefits from me not having those kinds of needs? but also to recognize our role in it is like, am I even trying to take up any space in this relationship? Or am I playing this role because it's safe and familiar for me, but like there's this huge cost to it? And I'm so glad you brought this up because for so many people who are coming out of these patterns or trying to heal, at some point in their healing process, there's a lot of anger that shows up. It can feel scary and overwhelming to know what to do with that, especially for women who were sort of extra conditioned to not feel anger or be angry. But anger is so important because it's telling us, just like every other emotion carries information, anger is telling us a boundary has been crossed, a need is unmet, or, someone's harming you or someone you love. There's something you need here. Pay attention to me. Or there's been some injustice somewhere in your life, right? Someone minimizing your pain, denying your pain, not protecting you. And all of those are actually instances where anger fits. When we can listen to that and make space for it, it actually can lead us to this beautiful place where we figure out how to start protecting ourselves and taking care of ourselves. But if we stay in that mode of what we might call fawning, which often looks like a lot of people pleasing and caretaking, we're often going to keep pushing that anger down. And the more we suppress that anger, not only is that not good for our emotional health, it doesn't feel good, and we keep ending up in these cycles of relationships, but it takes a really big toll on our physical health as well to suppress anger. There's a lot of research out there now connecting kind of qualities about people around people pleasing and caretaking with things like autoimmune disorders because that emotional suppression actually keeps us in a state of fight or flight. When that's functioning at a sustained level, what that does to the body, keeping it in a state of like cortisol activation, adrenaline activation, and the inflammation that sits in the body. So these issues are not just emotional, they also heavily impact our physical health.
I don't know, and this might even have been something that you shared, but I remember seeing that they were seeing such a high correlation between with women who were experiencing autoimmune disorders at a much higher rate and tying it back to this sense of that you are typically many oftentimes you are fawning, you are people pleasing, you do fall in that role. I don't know if you've seen that to be the case. I know it's not always this way or that, but it does seem like there would be a higher occurrence of that for us because we end up being in those roles either willingly or not.
If I had the research offhand, I wish I could cite that, but there's definitely research out there that shows there's a higher incidence of that with women. And so much of that is gender roles, the roles that women tend to play. There's cultural pieces to that too in your relationships, but we end up being the shock absorbers. You take it all in, you make it nice for everyone else, and we have this sense that we're keeping things nice and peaceful, which again, when you did that as a kid is so skillful. That's how you stayed safe and connected. But when we're adults, what we keep doing is we make it nice and peaceful for everyone else, but the turmoil and the chaos and the stress is all swimming inside of our bodies.
And you can feel it. I know that anyone listening probably has had moments in their life, even maybe now, where they are feeling the physical repercussions of keeping those emotions in, especially the anger. And when you were speaking about that, I was thinking how for me, I always suppressed anger specifically, and that it would come out when I would be drinking, for example, because that was when I no longer had the conscious, "I must shut this down" feeling, and it was always disastrous when that happens, especially in my early 20s, because we don't have these moments of, "Let me just let it out when I'm conscious and I'm sober and I'm, like, here," and I wish that I would have known this stuff then, you know? I think it would have probably saved a lot of relationships.
You're not alone in that. I mean, I think so many of us, had we known a lot of this early on, it would have changed things for us. And if anyone who's listening is in that place right now, to let you know you won't get stuck there, right? If you keep doing the work, you won't get stuck there as long as you're listening to what that anger is trying to tell you because it has a story. It's carrying information for us, just like every other feeling. But it is so important because what's tied in terms of action to anger is protective action. So being able to go back to that anger, this is a part of you that knows that there was some mistreatment or something that's not right. But if we ignore it, then we're just chronic self abandoners, and we stay stuck.
Always comes out some way, and usually in the worst possible way that I've seen from life. But yeah, I think that it's the lessons learned of expressing yourself before it gets to that point. We've talked kind of a little bit about there some aspects that stop people from connecting to others. So we've talked about the visibility, not being visible, not feeling like you're visible, being afraid maybe, and also holding in emotions like anger. What are some of the other fears that people have that maybe stop them from connecting to people?
Safety and trust, like, are two of the biggest ones that show up around what gets in the way of relationship connection. But the two that I see most in my practice and who I work with is the fear of being seen and the fear of abandonment. I would say fear of being seen not just shows up in relationships, but also can heavily impact our career and other life choices in a different way. Like fear of abandonment sometimes can get more compartmentalized to our very intimate, vulnerable relationships. But all of that can, will look different person to person.
This is where I can definitely see both of those, but the visibility one would be harder to hide in different areas that you would be aware of it. And you said something earlier which stuck with me that I'd love for you to explain a little bit more of how being seen is the same as being loved. When you said that, that was just a wow moment. What do you mean by that and how does that kind of play into the way that we connect with other people?
So I'll take you back to like thinking about childhood, like when you're very young and your caregivers, whether it's parents, grandparents, whoever else was in charge of your care, there's a few ingredients that are really necessary for us to develop secure attachment. And being seen is one of them. It's emotionally seen. It's seen as a person for who you are. In families where, whether it's a parent who has unresolved trauma or they have their own mental health issues, all the way to a parent who maybe struggles with narcissism, being seen is not always a given in those families. Children are maybe overlooked. They might be minimized, invalidated, punished. So to be seen is like to really see someone for who they are and to relate to them from that place with acceptance, love, and compassion. It's like seeing who you are at your core. So imagine if the first person who you have contact with in the world, in your life, as your nervous system's developing, as all these blueprints and templates are developing, doesn't see you or can't see you or won't see you. That's where we're going to have all those ripple effects. We can't even see ourselves. And that's why so much of the time as adults, people are sitting in my office going, well, I don't know who I actually am, right? This idea of authenticity sounds great. I don't know who I actually am. And that's because it was never mirrored back to us or it was never safe for any of that to shine through.
The deepest thing you can want from someone else is, like you said, to be seen. And it is in a relationship where you feel like someone genuinely sees what you are, how you are, your motivations, your desires, and they accept you.
If we have some of those experiences early on, or we have, whether it's with parents or people who are also in, playing an active role in our lives, that can obviously buffer and offset that because then we still get the experience that like this is possible. But if we don't have any of that, we don't even know that that's a possibility. You can tell yourself, but the body doesn't believe it because your nervous system never had the experience of feeling seen and regulated with someone else there. So that's often why also some of our cognitive approaches don't quite get deep enough with some of these early childhood wounds as well.
The fact that you related this back to the physical is so interesting because it is this sense of, do you know what it feels like to be seen, to be loved? You can express it, but can you recognize it? Can you feel it? And I always think how I had my first boyfriend, and I feel really grateful to him if he's listening. Because I experienced and felt with him that he really loved and cared for me, and I could see it in his eyes, and so in the future relationships, I could see when that love was there, like, I could physically experience it. I can understand how that would be so challenging if you hadn't ever had that experience.
Yeah, it gave you a reference point to know that not just that existed, but you had like the felt experience in your body of what it was like to be seen in that way.
Are there ways, though, that we can start to small steps or realizations or things to ponder on or think about that can start to take us towards this feeling of knowing who we are a bit more and feeling safer in our bodies, which I think are the two big ones that we've been sharing.
Before I get into the details of that, I want to say, because I think this gets overlooked, especially with our like, tidbits of information on social media, is your inner work, your individual work is so important. Like, we can't heal without doing that. But also being in healthy relationships is just as important. Speaks exactly to what you just shared because it gives us the experience and an opportunity to kind of work through these things with someone who's safe. And I know sometimes when we have those safe relationships, it can feel like, all our old stuff comes up and gets in the way of the relationship. But if you're doing the inner work alongside it, it's a really beautiful opportunity to challenge some of those things, give your body different experiences, and that's what starts to chip away. So for me, it's always a both and that's not just like your romantic relationship, it's friendships, it's community. But as far as individual work, like where do you start is what you're asking? Yeah, because this is it's a process. And just to frame that, since we're talking about attachment, I think about how between parent and child, it's a relationship. And it's through that relationship that we learn to feel safe, trusting, and regulated. So, our goal is to harness everything we know about the brain and the body to actually build that relationship within yourself. Two pieces to start with on a small level, tuning in to identify your emotions or your body sensations. That is the doorway for everything else, right? Where I talk about this a lot in my program is in order to get to the reparenting and the inner child work, we have to be connected within ourselves. And that's not easy when we spend a lifetime disconnected from ourselves. So some people might be listening going, well, I can't feel anything in my body, or I don't know what I feel, or it's too overwhelming. We want to start small and start in some small dose that your nervous system can tolerate. So if it's starting with the emotion or starting with sensations that feel pleasurable or neutral in your body, that's where we might start. And there's all sorts of ways that you can support yourself in bringing attention into your body. We talk a lot about mindfulness and meditation as one, it's not the only one. Movement can be wonderful to connect us to our bodies. Exercise falls into that as long as you're paying attention, right? Rather than like using it to zone out, which a lot of times can happen. Any opportunity you get to drop into your experience and think about that as like the development of the good inner parent, right? Checking in on the little kid. How are you doing? What's going on for you today? Like, what's going on in your body? What's going through your mind? And it's like just this attitude of care and attention to pay attention to yourself. Seeds of being seen is, can I even just notice myself and how I'm doing? The second piece of that is that kind of goes along with it is safety, right? For a lot of us, we can't go into our body or we can only go to a certain extent or into our emotions because it feels too unsafe. So, working to figure out what helps your nervous system feel a sense of safety or ease is so important. If you talk to people who teach about polyvagal theory, which is really kind of the different states of your nervous system, you might hear them talk about glimmers. The opposite of triggers, it's any experience or kind of micro moment that brings your nervous system up towards a sense of safety. Literally just like putting your feet in the grass or holding your cup of tea and actually just savoring the warm sensations there. Connection with other people or a pet. So many different ways. And all of that is going to depend on what registers as safe in your own body.
This is a good variety of things too, because you made a really important point here of what if I can't feel in my body? What if I can't reach the emotions? Maybe I've got this block. But if you can seek external stimuli and then feel that actively, things that don't feel so polarizing for you, like stepping in the grass or listening to music, things that are, neutral, as you said, or good, or the glimmers. That can allow you to start to notice this stuff more and more. It's so funny because I shouldn't make this parallel, but it is a lot like Pilates. with Pilates, when you're training to do it, I used to be an instructor, is you would go through every part of your body and talk about it being activated and how it feels in order to have the full workout, because people would come in and they wouldn't be able to just snap into those feelings. They would have to be guided through each part, and it makes sense in every part of your life that if you have this block, you need to ease in somehow.
I think that's a big message for people who are doing attachment healing, trauma work. And it's a big shift in terms of how we understand this work now is that slow is actually better. If we try to force that too fast, oftentimes that's where we can get really stuck in a state of fight or flight, freeze, shut down. Our change, our healing most often happens in these kind of like micro moments where we're making small changes or a slightly different choice. I spoke up for myself, or I at least felt like, ooh, that boundary didn't feel good. Or I actually spent this week paying attention to what my body needed. Those might sound small, but they're extremely significant when you're healing from almost a lifetime of neglecting your body the way that a caregiver may have neglected you physically or emotionally.
When people are thinking, I want to know a bit more about how to work through this, I want to bring more awareness to it, I'm open, I'm ready. How can they connect with you? And then also, what are the ways that you work with people?
So, for anyone who's in the state of California, you can reach out to me in my private practice for individual therapy. Outside of that, and something that gives you actually that community experience that many of us need for our healing, I offer a 6-month program called Heal the Inner Child. And then you have a weekly group call with me to help you apply those things, process those things, and get support as part of a community. We need different things at different times in our healing. So, this program integrates attachment, it integrates neurobiology, some nervous system work, self compassion, some parts work. Find on my website, also on my Instagram, Dr. Deniz ID, all the information is there.
I want to thank you for being on the show, for going deep with everything.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.